Welcome to another lecture in our series of online tutored tastings and lectures, which were recorded during the COVID-19 situation in 2020. This tasting and tutorial will all be about Bodaimoto, which is a type of yeast starter. Now, obviously, when I did this live, we tasted the sake and went through the tasting. We can't do that on this particular occasion, but I will introduce the sake we tried and talk about that very briefly, and then move on to the lecture part of the session, so I can tell you all about Bodaimoto. So as mentioned, Bodaimoto is a type of yeast starter, and I'll explain why you need to do that. But first of all, the sake we tried was from Gozenshu, which is based in Okayama Prefecture. They produce a bunch of different sakes, but they're really trying to focus on Bodaimoto, and they make a quirky isn't quite the right word, but a different style of Bodaimoto, which I'll go into towards the end of the lecture, and how theirs differs from the historical and Nara-based Bodaimoto method. But anyway, Gozenshi are based in Okayama, and this particular sake uses Okayama grown or machi rice. It's a junmai, and it's a Bodaimoto. It uses Kyokai Kobo number 9, so that's association yeast number 9, which I don't have the time to go into right now. Matured for 1 year and twice pasteurized. So, of course, the focus of this particular lecture is on Bodaimoto. If you want to grab a bottle of this sake, it's available on our website, tengusake.com, and you can try it. It also has a Namazake sister, which is fantastic, and it's really fun to try them side by side, because the only difference between the two is that one is Namazake and the other one is pasteurized and matured for a year. So really interesting to try the two side by side, because you get a good appreciation of the difference between Nama and pasteurized sake. So Bodaimoto, as I say, is a type of yeast starter. So in this diagram, this is the part of the production process that we're going to focus on. Very, very, very briefly, when you create sake, first thing you do after you've harvested or taken delivery of your rice is polish it to remove the outer layers. Then you're going to wash it and soak it. Then there's a little bit of steaming, and one of the next stages, so some of us, you'll also be making koji, which we'll talk about in a sec, but the next step really is to create this yeast starter. So why do we need a moto, or another word for it is shubo? Both mean the yeast starter. So why do we need it? So fundamentally, we need a moto to develop a high population of yeast, which can be sustained throughout the main fermentation, and that's called the moromi. So we can't just whack all the ingredients of sake into one tank straight away, into a big tank straight away, and let it run, because the population of yeast is not high enough to sustain the fermentation. So what you need to do is create a very small starter fermentation, which is healthy, vigorous, and once that's established, you can then build that up into a full-size fermentation. So that's the reason we do the moto. So how do we create this sustained fermentation? Well, what we do is we do it by creating an environment where only sake yeast can flourish. Now, sake is brewed, fermented in open tanks, so loads of other stuff can get in there. So we need to create an environment where it's only really sake yeast that can flourish and survive and do its thing. And we do that by creating a high lactic acid concentration. So sake yeast is resistant to lactic acid. So therefore, if we create an environment which is high in lactic acid, only the sake yeast is going to be happy. Everything else is going to get destroyed, denatured. We also need to create lots of sugar, because of course, yeast feeds on sugar, and it's the sugar that's going to convert into alcohol. So where does that sugar come from? The sugar comes from koji, kin. Koji kin means the fungus or the mold of koji. Okay, so koji kin is a special type of fungus. So it comes in spore form usually, and you sprinkle it over a large, let's just say over steamed rice, and then over the course of about 48 hours, its function is to break down. So the koji kin, the fungus, secretes an enzyme which breaks down the complex carbohydrate, the starch that's in the sugar, I beg your pardon, the starch that's in the rice, breaks that down into more simple carbohydrate, sugar. So the four main ingredients of sake are water, rice. Your rice has the starch in it, no sugar. Koji. So koji is the rice that's had the koji kin sprinkled on it. So now this koji has is rice that's been broken down and has started the starch to sugar conversion. So that's where the sugar comes from. Then your fourth ingredient, yeast, takes over and converts those now fermentable sugars into alcohol. So the sugar comes from the addition of the koji kin onto steamed rice, and once 48 hours later, once that process is completed, we drop the word kin because it's not the fungus anymore and just call it koji. And koji is the one of the main ingredients of sake. As I say, water, rice, koji, yeast. Koji is doing the starch to sugar conversion. Yeast is doing the sugar to alcohol conversion. Okay, that's not really what this lecture is about. We'll do other ones on fermentation, but this is, you need to understand that really to be able to grasp what's happening with the moto or shugo, so the yeast starter. Okay, typically in the overall fermentation, so all the rice is added into the fermentation, so the big tank I was referring to about earlier, koji makes up about 7% of it. But in the shubo, you need a lot more of it. Typically, it makes up maybe 33%. Obviously, these are roundabout numbers, approximate numbers, but it makes a lot more up because we need that sugar, because we need the yeast to thrive and survive and get a population high enough so that when we go up to the bigger fermentation, we are successful. So there are lots of different types of shubo or moto yeast starter. The two most common schools are Kimoto-ke shubo or sokujo-ke shubo. Now, Kimoto-ke is made up of both Kimoto and Yamahai. We're not going to be talking about in this particular lecture. I'll talk about another lecture. And then sokujo is what tends to be referred to as the modern method. There are more modern methods, but we're not going to talk about those. But sokujo, somewhere between 90 and 95%, I would say, of all sake is made using sokujo. Okay? And in order to really understand Bodaimoto, we need to look at sokujo in order to understand why, what that's all about, and so we can contrast Bodaimoto with it. So, sokujo, developed in 1910. So, as I say, relatively recent method in the history of sake brewing. Yeah. So the key takeaway here, day one, we add all our ingredients. So water, rice, koji, yeast. The yeast starter, the moto, in this case, we're talking about sokujo shubo. Again, shubo is the same name, the same word as moto, means the same thing. So in sokujo shubo, the yeast starter, these four ingredients are combined for the first time. Initially, water, koji, yeast, and lactic acid are put together. When I say lactic acid, I just mean lactic acid that's like bought off the shelf, so synthesized or created, artificially created lactic acid. So just buy that off the shelf and whack it in. Remember, we create an environment where only the sake yeast can survive by creating a high lactic acid concentration. So you just add lactic acid in. So you add all those four ingredients in, and a couple of hours later, you also add in your steamed rice. The reason for the slight pause is to allow the koji and the yeast to kind of awaken. Then, very simply, the koji does its thing and converts the starch to sugar, and the yeast does its thing and converts that sugar to alcohol. The lactic acid is allowing the environment where only the sake yeast can survive. So a couple of weeks later, boom, you're done. There's then a kind of cooling period, so it allows it to come down to about 7 degrees over, the course of about a week, something like that. But essentially, we regard sokujo shubo as a 2-week process, approximately. There are people doing different things either side of those 2 weeks, and so much as some bread maybe do it faster, some slower, and all sorts of stuff. But 2 weeks is the general kind of formula for it. Okay, so sokujo, main thing you take away here is you're adding lactic acid at the beginning, because you can just buy it and stick it in. For those of you that have never seen a shubo before and are having difficulty visualizing it, this is a video which I hope will help. So here, gentleman is stirring up the mixture, and it is a sokujo shubo, so it's your water, rice, koji, steamed rice, I said that, water, steamed rice, koji, yeast, and lactic acid, all in there being stirred up. You see it's quite thick, and the tank is, in this case, quite tall, about human height, I'd say. It's mixing it all up to promote the action of the enzymes from the kojikin, or the koji, starting to convert the starch to sugar, and the yeast to do the sugar to alcohol. Okay, so Bodaimoto. Hopefully you've grasped the purpose of why we make a shubo, and you've grasped that the modern method, its fundamental point is that you're adding lactic acid, so you're buying and adding lactic acid right at the beginning, creating an environment where only the yeast, sake yeast, can survive. Now, we still need to create an environment where sake yeast can survive, but back in the day, so Bodaimoto is a medieval method for making the yeast starter, and it creates its own lactic acid. So it originated sometime in or before the 14th century, and of course, in or before the 14th century, you couldn't just buy lactic acid. You had to create it some other way. And these very clever chaps, the Shoryakuji monks, developed a technique for doing this after studying fermentation techniques in Japan and China. So it was originally just a one-step brewing process, and then it developed into having a moto, having the yeast starter, and the 3-step build up to monomi. So modern formula, standard recipe is using something called sandanjigumi, which is a 3-step building up process. So create the yeast starter, the moto, and then over the course of, once that's finished, over the course of 4 days, you do 3 additions, making it more and more and more and more until you've got the big fermentation. When Bodaimoto was originally developed, you didn't have a moto really, you just whacked all the ingredients in and you didn't build it up. Okay, but in order to do it, in order to make it work, you had to have a way of synthesizing this lactic acid, and that's what Bodaimoto, and incidentally Kimoto and Yamahaya are about, but Bodaimoto is the original technique for that. So a little bit complicated. Here we go. So at the beginning, we're not adding koji, we're not adding yeast, and we're certainly not adding lactic acid. So instead, you're adding steamed rice, but only about 10% of the overall volume of the rice that you're adding is steamed. The other 90% is raw rice, okay, totally untouched, as it were, not polished or nothing like that, okay. The cool rice, the steamed rice is allowed to cool in the air before it's added in. And by allowing it to cool in the air, naturally occurring yeast and a special type of lactic acid bacteria amylolytic lactic acid bacteria settle on the rice and inoculate it. So when you add that in, those are the natural yeast and the amylolytic lactic acid bacteria can work. And they do, well, the amylolytic lactic acid bacteria do a heterolactic fermentation. So they convert starch to sugar, just like koji does in the sokujo method, and they produce lactic acid. So they do two things simultaneously. And what's interesting is the techniques that the Shurakuji monks came up with and the temple in which they developed it. There's been some studies, and it's shown that the water that's used in that particular temple contains a very specific natural lactic acid bacteria. And this is this amylolytic lactic acid bacteria that I'm talking about that does this heterolactic fermentation of both starch to sugar and producing lactic acid. Additionally, the raw rice that's added in the Bodaimoto technique, the raw rice contains saccharification enzymes, so amylase and glucoamylase enzymes that are going to allow starch to sugar conversion as well. Okay, because remember, steamed rice only makes up 10% of the overall ingredients. 90% is this raw rice. So there are some big differences, and Bodaimoto is quite complicated. But the main difference is at the beginning, a number of main differences, but the real takeaway here is we don't have lactic acid. We can't buy it. We can't add it as an ingredient. So we're trying to create it, and we're creating it completely naturally. So after about a week, traditionally, it was when you started to notice bubbles on the surface, so CO2 being given off, you would then press or filter the sake, and out of it, you get this soyashi mizu, which is a very high lactic acid content, well, not very high, but high lactic acid concentration water. So in what you've done in that first week is you've created a kind of lactic acid. It's also got naturally occurring yeast in it as well. Yeah, because we allowed the steamed rice to cool. Week 2, you now start a brand new motto. Water, steamed rice, koji for the first time, soyashi mizu, in it goes. And your soyashi mizu is where you're getting your lactic acid from and where you're getting your yeast from. Okay? So the purpose of week 1 is really to create the two ingredients that you can't just that don't just occur. Can I say this? You can't add in right at the beginning back in the 14th century. Okay, so with the modern method, you add all of those things right at the beginning. But with Bodaimoto, you don't. You create two of them, lactic acid and yeast, a high population of yeast, and then you add that into a brand new motto week 2. It then kind of proceeds as per. Okay, fascinating though. Very, very different. Now, Bodaimoto, it isn't a legally protected term, but there's a kind of an agreement that I'll tell you a little bit more about this in a second, but the Shurakuji monks originally developed the technique. It was then lost to time. No one was creating it. It was then rediscovered, and I'll talk about that in a sec. It was then rediscovered, and now there's a group of the Shurakuji temple is in Nara prefecture. And so there's a group of brewers in Nara which have clubbed together, and they create Bodaimoto sake. Not all their sake is Bodaimoto, but they make some Bodaimoto sake. And the motto is created in the same temple as it was historically. So you have, as I was discussing, the special water, and you have the kind of micro environment, so the environment where the original microbes were, and that's where that motto was created. It's then distributed to the various breweries, and they create their sake from there. Sake that uses the Bodaimoto technique but isn't created within the Shurakuji temple, out of respect, people tend not to call it Bodaimoto. And there is another expression, Mizu-moto, which is used instead. So technically, well, not really technically, but as a kind of gentleman's agreement, Bodaimoto tends to refer to sake made in Nara, specifically when the motto, the Bodaimoto, the motto of that is made in the temple. When it's not made there, Mizu-moto. However, the sake that I did the tasting around, Gozenshu, this brewery, as I say, based in Okayama, these guys are the people that rediscovered the Bodaimoto technique. So in 1984, the CEO of Gozenshu was given a book of woodblock prints and woodblock prints, and within that book, there was the recipe for Bodaimoto. And so he handed this over to his toji, so his master brewer, Harada-san, and asked him to pursue this and to make a viable, a decent Bodaimoto. And so in 1986, the first batch of Bodaimoto was created for many, many, many years. However, there were some differences. Obviously, it wasn't created in the temple, where it was where the technique originated, and also Harada-san made some tweaks to the recipe, which I'm going to go through in a second. Gozenshu do call their sake Bodaimoto, and it's my understanding that that is an agreement of respect between Gozenshu and the temple, the Shurakuji monks, because when Gozenshu created their first batch, they introduced it to their one of their distributors, and the distributor was I don't know if he was devout, but a very religious Buddhist, and so he took it to the Shurakuji temple, showed it to the monks, say, look what's happened, and that's what started off the whole Nara, the kind of revival of Nara Bodaimoto. So Gozenshu was responsible for reviving it, and so out of respect, it's my understanding that the Shurakuji monks allow Gozenshu to use or approve of, because I say there's no restriction, but approve of and have that kind of stamp of approval on Gozenshu using the term Bodaimoto, despite the fact it's not made in the temple in Nara, and it doesn't actually follow the exact recipe. It follows the principle and the spirit of it, as I'll explain, but doesn't follow the recipe exactly. So why doesn't it follow the recipe? Why did they tweak it? So again, my understanding, having spoken to them, is it makes the technique easier. It allows non-naturally occurring yeast to be used. So it allows any of the kyokai, so the yeast association, Kobo kyokai yeast to be used. So therefore, it can be used to make more diverse sake using any of the yeasts available. Whilst also you can use naturally occurring yeast should you wish. It's slightly less aggressive in the lactic acidity vibe. And they argue that it captures the essence of the original method, which is about synthesizing or creating lactic acid. Okay, so there's a bit of history there. So how does Bodaimoto made by Gozenshu differ? Well, what they do is, if you remember with the original Bodaimoto recipe, it's water, polished rice that's been steamed, and raw rice. Okay, here you've got water and koji. That's your those are your two ingredients. That's what they're doing. So because in the original recipe you had that special type of lactic acid bacteria that was converting the starch to sugar and creating lactic acid, well here that was difficult to achieve because you didn't have that special lactic acid bacteria. So here they're using all koji, which does the starch to sugar. And naturally occurring lactic acid bacteria, which is in the brewery, falls in and starts to create the lactic acid. So again, they then press or filter the sake, creating the soyashi mizu, which is high in lactic acid, and then use that in a brand new moto, just like with the traditional Bodaimoto technique: water, steamed rice, koji, soyashi mizu, and they're adding their own. They're adding kyokai kobo yeast. Okay. So very similar, and similar in essence, in the reason why they do it. So that's my end of my lecture on Bodaimoto. I very much encourage you to go and check it out. It's a really exciting style of sake making. I encourage you, of course, to try Gozenshi's sake. They've released a new brand called Gozenshu 1859, which is all around omachi rice. And I believe all of that will be Bodaimoto. And then I also encourage you to try the various other Mizu-moto or Bodaimoto that are in Japan. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to send me some at contact@tengusake.com or leave any comments below. Thank you very much for your time. Kanpai.